A few weeks ago, I attended an IPA webinar that had to do with the move under COVID-19 to Zoom, telephone, Skype, FaceTime, other modalities, telephone, to do online psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And four senior psychoanalysts were discussing all of this. One point important to be noted, I think it was Glenn Gabbard who emphasized the difference between, well, he posed three modalities of delivery of psychoanalysis. Conventional in-office treatment. Secondly, virtual treatment using screens, Zoom, Skype, etc., with the video on. And then telephone. And he made an important distinction between telephone therapy or analysis and different forms of virtual analysis. I think there was wide agreement on this panel, and in discussions with my own colleagues, there's a considerable degree of agreement that telephone is quite different from Zoom, Skype, and so on with the video on. Mainstream psychoanalysts have always mainly used the couch if they were delivering therapy in the chair with the patient and the analyst sitting facing one another or at a slight angle to one another. That was largely considered psychotherapy, analytic psychotherapy. In the mainstream, psychoanalysis was reserved for treatment employing the couch with the analyst sitting behind or beside and a bit behind. Both the patient and the analyst facing in the same direction, looking on at the same wall or whatever. 3-4 times a week. Some of us are less preoccupied with the frequency. Over the years, I've done a fair amount of 1 time per week psychoanalysis. Patient lying on the couch. There's no doubt that frequency makes a difference. We get further more quickly if we meet twice a week. It's even better when we meet 3 times a week. I rarely have felt the need to see anyone 4 times a week, although in my training that was what I was required to do, and that is what my institute still requires patients to do. 4 times a week on the couch. Certainly candidates in training have to see their training analysts 4 times a week on the couch. Okay, the point is that because we are used to the patient being on the couch, we see the patient face to face for a few seconds when they arrive, and then they lie down, and then we see them for a few seconds when they get up to leave. But during most of the 50 minutes, we are not looking at each other. As I say, we're looking on at some blank space on the wall. So it is a talking cure to that extent, although the talking also delivers a lot of emotional communication. So I'm not restricting it entirely to the verbal, because the verbal stirs emotion, often quite intense emotion. I'm not talking about body language. Some analysts think that one of the reasons we put people on the couch is to put body and body language out of commission. I'm not interested in studying the patient's face, and I'm not interested in studying the twitches in the patient's body or the shifting around on the couch particularly. I'm not seeking to read body language. I'm listening. And because that's the way mainstream analysts have worked, primarily as listeners rather than viewers, virtual analysis, in which patient and analyst are staring at one another on screens, is pretty alien to the way that psychoanalysis has mostly been practiced. Obviously far less alien to the way psychotherapy has been practiced. Even when psychoanalysts are delivering the psychotherapy face-to-face in chairs, virtual analysis resembles that. But virtual analysis with screens is very alien to the way analysts have conducted psychoanalysis per se, with the patient on the couch and the analyst a little bit out of view behind and beside the couch. Okay, telephone therapy, telephone analysis is much closer to the classical analytic situation than virtual analysis is. Some colleagues have told me that there is some actual research that indicates that people's voices convey more about underlying emotional states than do their faces, which shouldn't be a surprise. Actors put on various faces. Human beings are capable of doing face work, controlling their expressions. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the false self often controls the face. It's a little harder for the false self to control the voice. Obviously not entirely impossible, but sometimes deeper feeling states leak into the voice. So personally, I much prefer the telephone. If I'm going to start with a new patient, I want to see them on the screen for the first session or so. And I think it's important that they see me during the initial assessment. But if we decide to work together, when we start, we go to the telephone. The patient can recline on a couch with the telephone. I put in my earbuds and I listen. And of course, I also speak. But I try to do a good deal of receptive listening before I have anything really very much to say. Okay, that's one of the things that came out of that IPA webinar, the difference and the importance of the telephone as a modality to deliver distance analysis. I think it's rather exciting that the IPA has authorized telephone and virtual analysis because this makes analysis far more accessible than it has ever been to people who live outside major cities. Here in Canada, many physicians practicing psychotherapy would like to have supervision and would like to have training, but there's no way they could make it to the few major Canadian cities that have psychoanalytic institutes. But perhaps now we will be able to accept such people into training using telephone, Skype, etc. Okay. In that webinar, and this is the main point of this talk, several of the analysts expressed anxiety about what they see as the potential erosion of what they see as the analytic position. It's interesting that they are using that word position, kind of borrowing from Melanie Klein's model of the mind as composed of two positions rather than stages, positions, something like geological layers of the mind, both remaining active throughout life, one more primitive, one more mature. Anyway, these analysts take that term position. They're not, I don't think, trying to define it entirely in the Kleinian terms, but they speak of the analyst position. And it's a little vague as to what they mean, but I gather that they fear that virtual analysis and telephone analysis may have a tendency to erode our analytic position. Now, certainly part of what they mean is that traditionally we seek, as psychoanalysts, to get at the unconscious mind, unconscious processes, not merely conscious and preconscious processes. We're not just empathizing with where the patient is at consciously or even preconsciously. We are trying to listen with the third ear. Theodore Reich's wonderful, the title of one of his books, Listening with the Third Ear, by which he meant a mode of listening that instead of getting overly focused on the manifest messages, it's listening for the latent messages, the manifestations of unconscious thought, unconscious fantasy, the subtext, the slips of the tongue, the dreams, which help us get beyond the manifest to the latent. Okay, I entirely share that goal. I think most mainstream psychoanalysts do, although I have to say that it seems that many of the self-relational intersubjective analysts may really have downplayed this or turned away from it altogether. They seem quite preoccupied with empathic attunement with where the patient is at, and they seem to mean where the patient is at in terms of more manifest feeling and thinking. Mainstream psychoanalysts are not content with that. We want to get to what the patient is not aware of. We're not merely interested in resonating with the patient's awareness or semi-awareness. We want to get to what is behind that. Now, of course, a lot of the self-relational intersubjective people seem to think that it's impossible to get at what's behind that. And mainstream analysts, when they think they're doing that, all they're really doing is projecting either their own mental states, feelings, and fantasies, or their theory-driven ideas are being projected onto the patient. The analyst thinks he's reading the patient. He's really reading Sigmund Freud or Melanie Klein or whoever. That's what they think, some of them. Certainly Stollerow and Atwood have said this, that instead of reading the patient's unconscious, we're engaging in a kind of imposition. We're screening the patient through our theories. And that this, they think, at times amounts almost to a kind of mental rape, or at least some kind of authoritarian imposition. I entirely disagree with this. I, of course, believe there is an unconscious. I'm with Freud about his fundamental discovery that we are at the very least double, that we are all both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that I strive constantly to censor myself. I have thoughts and feelings that I'm very uncomfortable with and do not want to know about, and resist knowing and defend against knowing and try very hard to not know. But it's very embarrassing to be a patient in analysis, an analysand, because my unconscious speaks in very embarrassing ways. It produces embarrassing dreams. It produces slips of the tongue, which reveal that while saying one thing, another part of me is thinking and feeling an entirely opposite. The classic formulation or illustration of the slip of the tongue that I always use when teaching is, he is consciously trying to say to her, "I love you." But in order to get those words out, he has to suppress the opposing tendency, which would be to say, "I hate you." Okay? A conflict between loving and hating feelings. Three outcomes are possible. One, he struggles to suppress the hate, and he actually gets the sentence out and says, "I love you." It's a little forced. It sounds a little forced. It is a little forced, because to get it out, he's had to repress the opposite. A second outcome is that he makes the slip and says, intending to say "I love you," he says, "I hate you," or "I love you." Well, that's pretty obvious to read. But there's a third, and this is the most interesting possibility. Instead of saying either "I love you" or "I hate you," he says something nonsensical like "I late you," "I love you." So there's the L from the love combined with the ATE of the hate, "I late you." That is a compromise formation. I never liked the word compromise formation because it sounds as if people are sitting around a table being very rational and reasonable and hammering out a compromise. It's less of a compromise than it is a blend or a compound. Compound, as in chemistry, H2O, whatever. A compound or an alloy. And of course, psychoanalysis seeks to take such compounds and break them down into their component elements. The "I hate you," the "I love you," which have meshed together in a compromise or a compound and produced "I late you." We are listening with the third ear. We are listening for such slips and dreams. And we're trying to help the patient who is interested in this. I mean, in the first few sessions, he has learned what psychoanalysis is. He has decided that he wants to engage in this process. And so he and I are working together to listen with the third ear. Now, he's speaking. He's doing his best to freely associate. And I'm receptively listening with what Freud called evenly hovering attention. And together we are working to psychoanalyze him. We're not working to psychoanalyze me. I had my years lying on the couch before my training, before I even decided to train. My decision to train came out at the end of 2 years of personal analysis for personal reasons. And then during the training, I was on the couch. So I've spent a lot of time analyzing myself. And of course, once you've had a formal analysis, or in my case with 4 different analysts, the rest of one's life is devoted to ongoing self-analysis. Freud didn't think much of self-analysis, but on the other hand, that's the only analysis he really had. And he got a long way with it. But certainly self-analysis is far from sufficient. After a formal analysis, one continues one's self-analysis. But one receives a bit of analysis from one's colleagues. In my case, I married a psychoanalyst, so I get some analysis. from her, gentle and respectful. And so the analysis goes on, and it is never ending, because the unconscious is infinite, and there is always something to analyze, because we're always lying to ourselves, because we are self-deceivers, and because we can't see the back of our own heads. Other people can see things in us that we have great difficulty seeing, and things that we often very much need to see. Okay, so does this technology, distance therapy, threaten our analytic position, understood as an attempt to get at the unconscious? Well, I think it does. Certainly virtual technology with screens on, I think this greatly threatens the project of analyzing the unconscious, as does conducting psychotherapy in the office, but in the chairs rather than the couch. I'm a great believer in the couch. Many self and relational and intersubjective analysts and some existential analysts have abandoned the couch. They promote the idea of existential encounter, face-to-face. I think this is a mistake. I share their view of the importance of an existential encounter. To use Martin Buber's terms, an I-thou encounter in analysis. But this does not require sitting in chairs. It doesn't require being face-to-face. In deep analyses that go on for some time, there certainly is an existential encounter between me and my patients. But they're on the couch, I'm in the chair, we're working together. The patient is challenged, patient challenges me. We work together to try to get at some uncomfortable truths. Is this threatened by the technology? I think it is threatened by screens, just as it's threatened by chairs. The best way to get at the unconscious is, if you're in the office, to be on the couch with the analyst behind. If you can't be in the office under these times of COVID, then go to the phone. After meeting the analyst once or twice with screen on, then screens are off. And it's the auditory channel that we are working with. And there it is possible still to do real psychoanalysis, I believe. Now, that too is threatened by the telephone. And it's threatened by shared social crises. I mean, when patients call me, they usually ask how I am, and I'm interested in how they're doing under quarantine and so on. So that didn't used to be the case because there wasn't this widespread sense of ongoing threat. And also with the telephone, there's a tendency to be too chatty. I've had to remind myself, correct myself, and work hard to retain my analytic position on the telephone. That is, to resist this tendency to be too chatty, to remind myself that this is not friendship. This is a professional relationship. The goal is to get at the unconscious, which means I have to shut up. I don't mean pretend to be dead. Many of you may have seen my video on the still face. I don't believe in the poker face, the still face, but I do believe in being a quiet listener, at least for the first half of the session, to gather the spontaneous associations, because I want to hear that. I don't want to interrupt the patient's flow, which means I have to be more comfortable with silence on the telephone than people usually are on the telephone. I think we've learned over the years how to sit with the patient in the office on the couch. We've learned how to sit in silence for varying stretches of time, and there are many kinds of silence. There is hateful silence. There is loving silence. But we've learned how to do that when the patient's in the room on the couch. I had to learn how to do this on the telephone because it feels a little bit odd, at least at the start. Patient phones, I answer. Now I have to force myself not to chat. I have to force myself to sit silently, which itself is a reminder to the patient that we're here to work together. And it's time now for him to go to work, which means to do his best to freely associate. I never liked Freud's idea of the basic rule, which is very superego-ish. I think of it as an invitation to the patient to utilize his or her free speech. Use your free speech. Speak freely. Try not to censor. Try not to judge something as irrelevant. Say it anyway, even if it's embarrassing. Say it anyway. Say everything. Okay, so that requires an extra effort, although now that I've been doing it since March, it's getting easier to reestablish the analytic position of relative silence and receptive listening. It is possible to do psychoanalysis on the telephone. Okay, but do those analysts who worry about virtual analysis, including telephone analysis, do those analysts who worry that this is going to disrupt our analytic position, do they mean more than what I've just outlined? What else do they mean by our analytic position beyond that of trying to get at the unconscious? I suspect they mean, or some of them mean something more. And a clue to this is there in the word position. Sometimes we talk about a person's social position. And usually what we mean is their position in a hierarchy of some sort. Am I upper class? Am I upper middle class? Am I middle class? Am I lower class? Am I working class? In some societies, these differences are more overt and marked, as, for example, in the UK, which still has a pretty stratified and pretty clear class society. In America, there's not supposed to be classes. Of course, there are. It's very clear, but it's not widely recognized or affirmed, but it's there. So do some analysts worry that they're going to lose their position, that somehow going to virtual or phone analysis may actually be a radically democratizing move? I mean, think about it. In the past, the patient is often younger, much younger often than the analyst, may just be starting out in life or in a fairly junior position in their field of work. They are often financially not nearly as well off as, say, a senior analyst. So they come to the analyst's office. Maybe they ride their bike, or maybe they come on public transportation. Now, this is not often the case, but sometimes the analyst's office is very bourgeois. It may be an office he rents that is expensive. One thinks of New York, plush, expensive offices. It may be in the analyst's home, and his home might be pretty expensive and maybe out of the range of the hopes and aspirations of young people who are beginning. And so here they arrive at this expensive office or this expensive home, and they come into this well-appointed consulting room. The couch may be some fine antique. There may be expensive art on the walls. There may be expensive-looking sculptures in the office. It may look pretty bourgeois. Now, not all analytic offices are like this, but many older analysts have pretty well-appointed rooms where they see their patients. So the younger, less wealthy patient arrives, and they're a little intimidated. And they encounter a gray-haired analyst sitting back comfortably in his big leather chair, perhaps his feet up on an ottoman. And they lie down on this expensive-looking couch. And as young people, they may have aspirations to one day accrue some wealth and some position themselves, but this man or woman has already achieved quite a bit, and the younger patient is impressed and begins to speak to try to free associate. The analyst is pretty silent. This is a kind of hierarchical position which invites certain kinds of transferences. It invites idealizing transferences, such that sometimes the patient feels he's been blessed and allowed to join a kind of a cult in which he gets to see the guru 3 or 4 times a week. He's given an audience by the guru who lets him come into his sacred space, and he's joined the religion of psychoanalysis, and he's admiring, and he's impressed, and he has this idealizing transference. Other patients, this hierarchical situation stimulates unconscious envy and hostility. And of course it invites child-parent transference situations. The analyst is the parent, and the patient is like the child, and the patient really gets into this. And now, if this happens, and the analyst knows what he's doing, he analyzes this. But sometimes analysts enjoy it too much. They don't just analyze it. Maybe sometimes they don't analyze it very much at all. They enjoy being in this hierarchically superior position. They enjoy the deference, the idealization. With the other kind of patient who becomes hateful and envious, the analyst may not enjoy that nearly so much. Okay, so when we worry about going to virtual and phone analysis, are we going to lose our analytic position? If losing our position, we mean our position of hierarchical superiority, then it's a good thing that we lose it. I welcome the democratizing elements. The patient doesn't have to schlep all the way over to my office. He or she may comfortably be in their own place, and they don't have to be awed and intimidated by my bourgeois surroundings. And I'm in my place, they're in their place. In that sense, there's they don't have to come to me, they just have to dial my number. There is something democratizing about this, and I welcome it. Because that type of analytic position has been a corruption of psychoanalysis from the get-go. In these ways, psychoanalysis strayed into becoming a kind of religion or a kind of a cult. There are plenty of gurus out there already. We're supposed to be in the process of dismantling cult creation by analyzing the transference dynamics at the basis, but often psychoanalysis, instead of analyzing and dispelling the transference, has in some ways actually promoted it and preserved it instead of fully analyzing it. You just have to look at the history of psychoanalysis itself, all of those unresolved transferences, idealizing devotional transferences to Freud, the inability to be critical of Freud without being called a Freud basher, as if there's only these two positions. You either worship him or you're a Freud basher. I mean, that's paranoid schizoid functioning, and we've seen plenty of this in the history of psychoanalysis. Unresolved transferences to the training analyst. This has been widespread. And if going to the telephone helps dispel this so that patient and analyst can get on with the process of the analysis and not be captured by this new religion. I mean, people are seeking religion, particularly in today's society with the decline of the traditional religions. People are looking for meaning, starved for meaning, anxious, climate crisis, COVID crisis, economic crisis, widespread anxiety. And in situations of anxiety, people turn to the gods and to magic. And sometimes people take that quest for God and magic into psychoanalysis. And sometimes the analyst is too cooperative with this. And instead of analysis, we get a kind of conversion to a new faith. Psychoanalysis is supposed to be analyzing all of this, not enacting it. So in this sense, I'm enthusiastic. Again, not about the shift from the office to screens. To me, that's problematic. But the shift from the office to the telephone, analysts can learn how to do psychoanalysis over the telephone. A bit of new learning is involved in this, but it's doable. And at the same time, I think it preserves a certain kind of equality, which rather than to be regretted is to be valued. Okay.